Great, okay, well thank you very much. So, as Jeff said, I'm Merf. Quick background on me, originally studied commercial horticulture in the UK, got into organic vegetable production, spent about 7 years managing veggie farms, then jumped the fence over into the research side of things and did a Master's and PhD down at Lincoln. And so I specialise in the kind of practical ag that the levy payer organisations like HortNZ do, but I'm focused on the sustainable space. Okay, so what this first presentation is, it's a primer on IPM, Biocontrol and Agroecology, because these are terms that are bandied around, but not everybody's actually fully on board with what they are. So I'm going to explain each of those in turn, and then right at the end, how they actually relate to each other, because they're quite different beasts. So first up, IPM. The P now stands for pests in the broad meaning, so everything including weeds, although it started out meaning pests as in insects, arthropods. So to contrast it, the old approach, which is now the old approach, calendar spraying. So IPM, the model is, very briefly, and I'll come back and explain this in a bit more, you establish an economic threshold, you monitor to see what your pest levels are like. If they're above that threshold, you do something about it. And the key thing about that doing thing about it is, don't just reach for the chemicals, use all the tools in all the toolboxes. And this is now becoming quite a well-worn cliche, but these are my 4 toolboxes, and I like this kind of arrangement because it's your 4 basic high school sciences: physics, chemistry, biology and ecology. And what we're doing is using tools from all of the toolbox in integrated pest management. So coming back to that framework again, so for each pest or disease, whatever, weed, you set an economic threshold. That's typically a fairly substantial piece of scientific work to work out what that threshold is. Once that is, that's everybody's threshold. And then as growers, you go out and get your contractors to go out. If the pests are below that threshold, you go back home. Because to undertake some kind of control measure, it's going to cost you more than the benefit you'll get, so it's economically not sensible. If the pest's above the threshold, you do something, and this is the key thing. For real IPM, you go for your softest options first. And that basically means the biological and ecological toolboxes. And if they don't work, then you reach for the physics. And if that's not working, then you reach for the chemistry. Typically where IPM is not done so well, it's the chemistry people reach for first, and that really should be the last option. Check to see whether your control action's worked. If it has, great, go back home. If it hasn't, continue figuring out what you're going to do, figure out a better toolbox. And as you will well know, those of you using IPM and monitoring frameworks, you're going out every week, every couple of weeks, monitoring to see what your pest levels are like. That's IPM. That's really nice and straightforward. Agroecology. This is quite a different beast. So agroecology is now over a century old, and it started off initially as a science studying farming through an ecological lens. Then about 40 years later, the scientists doing that, done a lot of studying, chaps. Shall we actually do some farming with an ecological mindset? So it kind of then went up a step. So kind of from version 1, version 2 is actually doing farming with an ecological mindset. And then in the 1980s, there's a full-on revolution, and this is what I'll call version 3 of agroecology. The guy said, kind of done a lot of studying of farming, but that's only half the food system. What about the consumption side of the food system as well? And even the post-consumption side, kind of what happens to the food after our customers have finished with it? Nutrient cycles, that kind of stuff. So it expanded across the whole food system. And as it did that, it kind of moved from just a kind of abstract academic discipline into a social movement and a political movement as well. So agroecologists have gone from essentially scientists studying farming at arm's length to essentially being activists. So if you want to know something's fairly dyed in the wool, you kind of ask, does the Food and Agriculture Organisation understand and support this? And the FAO are into agroecology, boots and all. And I've pulled up their 10 elements of agroecology. And this is just to give you a flavour. And remember, this is also version 3 of agroecology, so the full Monty political social activism stuff. The first of their 10 points here, diversity. This to me is a really critical one, particularly plant diversity. And I'm going to come back to this in later presentations. So diversity, both from everything from plants up to the social level. This co-creation and sharing of knowledge, agroecology is very much the scientist, a part of the farming system, not now standing separate from it. Synergies, again, at everything from plant level up to social level, but particularly for this project, the synergies achieved by having multiple plants and ecosystems. Efficiency is about trying to do more with less, so spending less down at the co-op in town, but increasing your profits. Recycling, making better use of resources. Resilience, particularly as we face increased extreme weather events, droughts, floods, etc. Making orchards, farm systems much more resilient to those kinds of challenging events. The human social values is kind of really outside this project. Culture and food traditions, so things like the slow food movement, traditional foods and farming systems. Governance is in here as well. This is kind of really quite high level stuff. And the circular economy as well. Europe now is very heavily focused on the circular bioeconomy. So for the lighter touch project, we're kind of leaving all the social, political stuff well outside the room. For me, these are the kind of key points of the FAO. The diversity stuff for me is really, really critical. And as you'll see as we go through this, this is really all about plant diversity. And as I put at the bottom there, this is about system redesign. This isn't tweaking stuff at the edges, making incremental changes. This is really going for a full Monty change. So third on the list, biocontrol. So this is controlling pests, diseases, weeds, using other organisms through these four means of interactions here, predation through to competition. And I want to touch on the first is the kind of difference between biocontrol. Biocontrol is where you're deliberately manipulating things or paying for stuff. And natural control is the biological control you get for free. And a couple of examples here. There's one paper from the States. They estimated that natural control of pests, diseases and weeds and stuff in the States was worth $4.5 billion US. That's quite a lot of money. This stuff's actually worth an awful lot of money on farm and on orchard. I think that's actually probably quite a significant underestimate, because from my second example here, I did a whole load of work controlling psyllid on potatoes using mesh crop covers, which is basically like fly screen over the crop, and I achieved essentially 100% control. I got about 4 psyllids under my mesh treatments, just quite astonishing. But we had this little problem with aphids, and what we think is going on is the winged mother aphids are landing on the mesh, and then they're producing nymphs, which every aphid entomologist I've talked to said they shouldn't be doing. The nymphs get underneath the mesh. Nobody else is in there. There's no natural enemies because the mesh is keeping all the natural enemies out. And that middle bar chart shows you what's happening if you have aphids in a potato crop with no natural enemies. They go completely ballistic. Literally the entire plants are just covered in aphids up to the point the plant just carks it. The control's really interesting. Although there's no statistical difference, the control's actually got the least aphids because it's got the most natural enemies in there controlling the aphids. So essentially if there was no natural control at all, crop pests would go completely ballistic and you would be out there almost continuously trying to spray. So that's why I think that 4.5 billion number is a drastic underestimate. So natural control is really, really valuable. One of the great ironies in this space is chemical-based pesticides really hammer a lot of those natural enemies that are helping us control our pests for free. So we're essentially shooting ourselves in the foot. So what we're aiming here is to really make this big leap forward into agroecological systems and using IPM, where we can maximise the benefit of those natural enemies and support them even more, essentially by doing biocontrol to make the guys that are out there working for us make their lives even easier. So biocontrol itself, there's 3 main divisions within biocontrol: importation, or what's typically known as classical biocontrol, augmentation and conservation, which gives us a whole load of really confusing acronyms, unfortunately. So let's look at each of those. So importation, classical biocontrol, New Zealand is the world leader in this, because basically our ecosystem is unique globally. We've imported our entire farming and growing systems from Northern Europe, all the crops, all the stock, all the pests, all the diseases, and all the weeds. Literally the whole farming system's transported. So we've introduced a lot of exotic organisms, and some of them have become really problematic, And so for classical, what you do, let's take gorse for example. You go back to the natural ecosystem where gorse evolved, you find its natural enemies, you bring them back over here and release them, and they go and attack the gorse. So this is what we call in ecology top-down regulation. There's something attacking, eating, parasitizing, whatever, consuming your problem. Bottom up is where a herbivore is starving for lack of food, for lack of pasture, for example. So we bring those things in, and this can work astonishingly well. And this is one of the textbook examples of absolutely genius classical biocontrol. Prickly pear cactus in the Australian rangelands, nothing will eat it, covers everything. They brought in Cactoblastus, which is a moth. Its larvae is a caterpillar which bores into the stems of the prickly pear and eats them from the inside out, and so it doesn't care about spines. It's basically wiped out prickly pear cactus in Australia. It's no longer a problem solved. The problem is, only 10% of the time you do classical biocontrol, you get that kind of astonishingly good result. About 50% of the time you get some level of control, from really good to kind of really almost non-existent, and the rest of the time you wasted your money on your lotto ticket. So these aren't actually terribly good odds. And what we've also found over the last couple of centuries of these kinds of things, there's been some absolutely astonishingly big cock-ups in this space. Mustelids in New Zealand, cane toads in Australia, you know, the list goes on and on of stuff that we've introduced to control a pest that's become a pest doll. So the reason that we don't go for this, it's hugely expensive, not just because we put scientists to go on planes to somewhere overseas to find natural enemies, but when they bring them back, we have to essentially prove that they're not going to attack anything else, which is where the massive costs lies, and essentially the risk management in this. So that's importation. We're not looking at that at all in this project. Too big, too long, too expensive. So augmentation is where the natural enemy already exists in the environment, but its numbers are very low, so we augment those numbers. And there's these two subforms, inoculative, we inoculate and inundate. So inoculative is where we put small numbers of the biocontrol agents into the environment. Typically these things, when they attack the pest, they increase in their numbers, they breed by feeding or parasitizing whatever the pest, and so their numbers increase, which is great because it's free. So you put small numbers in, they attack the pest, their numbers build up and keep on top of the pest. This is classic glasshouse biocontrol. You go down to the biocontrol shop every few weeks, buy some biocontrols, chuck them in the glasshouse, everything's tickety-boo. Inundative is where we literally swamp the pest with vast numbers of the biocontrol agents. So this is pretty much akin to how we're using pesticides, particularly now in an IPM type system. Good example here is good old BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, the likes of dipel. You are literally putting on billions, if not billions and billions of bacterial spores. You're inundating the pest with the biocontrol agent. And then the third form, conservation biocontrol, which most people have never heard of. And this is my late supervisor and Morgan professor as well. This is basically his entire life work, Professor Steve Ranton. So this is where the biocontrol agent, natural enemy, is already in the environment. It's struggling because it doesn't have food or somewhere to live. So what we go in is we go in and modify the environment, provide it food, whatever. Its numbers go up, it will attack our pest and bring it below the economic thresholds. And Steve Ranton's Green Wiper program is the textbook example in New Zealand. Leaf roller caterpillars in grapes, nightmare of a pest because it's in the bunches, hard to spray, stuffs the wine up. There's this parasitic wasp, a parasitoid, that's already in the vineyards. Several PhD students later, they figure out that buckwheat's really good for this parasitoid. They put buckwheat into the vineyard, parasitoid numbers go up, leaf roller caterpillar numbers go down below economic threshold, problem solved. End of story, full stop. Astonishing. So, Steve was, for those of you that know him, loved his little acronyms and metaphors and all the rest of it. One of his favourites was this thing. We're going to come back to this again. For SNAP, get BAP. So SNAP is this shelter, nectar, alternative hosts and pollen. These are the things we need to provide to the beneficials to boost their numbers. And then BAP is for buckwheat, alyssum and phacelia, what I call Steve's Holy Trinity. These plants, when they looked for plants to put into a farm orchard ecosystem, invariably one of these seemed to come up top trumps. So kind of if you want to just throw biocontrol at stuff in terms of providing the snap, throw these things at it. So how does all of this fit together? So agroecology is the system level stuff. It's the whole shooting match. IPM is a decision support tool within that, and then biocontrol is one set of those 4 toolboxes. Let's look at this as a diagram because it's probably a bit easier to understand as a diagram. So agroecology, the whole shooting match. Within that you have the 4 toolboxes of physics, ecology, biology and chemistry. But I've changed the size of those circles now to emphasise that biocontrol, biology and ecology are the main toolboxes. Physics is your kind of backup, and chemistry is the last resort, so it's the smallest toolbox now. And then IPM overlaps the physics, ecology and biology, because you can use those without IPM. But from my view, you really should never be reaching for the chemicals unless your IPM, your decision support system, has said you should use chemicals. So they're entirely within the IPM circle. So what we're doing in this project, and you've seen the quick examples Jeff's put up, is we're undertaking this agroecological, not a full agroecological project, but it's using agroecology as a way of thinking about redesigning the orchard. It's initially about arthropod pests, but agroecology doesn't just do one thing at a time. So we're addressing a whole bunch of things. We're mostly using conservation biocontrol in that, the snap stuff, putting flowers in to provide snap, and we're potentially going to go down to the biocontrol shop and get some biocontrol agents, particularly to kick the system off. So for me, we're using conservation biocontrol in this project because it's the kind of most agroecological approach. It's that system redesign. And if you get this stuff right, it's really kind of set and forget. You can set the thing up and then almost kind of walk away if it's working really, really well, which is kind of what the greening wiper is. Drill your buckwheat, problem solved. But the likes of greening wiper, that was 3 PhDs for 1 pest. It's really, really effective, and we know it works, we know why it works, we've done all the hard science, but we're essentially trying to find in this project the solution to a whole bunch of pests in really short timescales with nowhere near as much money as 3 PhDs costs. So essentially we're kind of really trying to do this kind of great leap forward from kind of where we are with standard IPM kind of practice into kind of what's the end goal, what's a complete system redesign look like in here. So this is kind of really somewhat a leap of faith, although we have done a whole bunch of research to underpin what we are doing. So we'll take any questions there on that little lot, just particularly if you need any clarification on any points, and then we'll leap into the next presentation.
Are you still using the solid cloth like people commercially using it?
Yes, they are. Promise it's vegetable growers using it, and they never tell each other anything. So we're pretty sure, I've stopped doing research on it because unfortunately the research funding went off to other things like nitrate leaching. But certainly in terms of psyllid, I'm kind of going, if you want to control psyllids on potatoes, use the mesh. And we have some ideas, basic conservation biocontrol ideas for dealing with the aphid problem. So we haven't done the research on that, but yeah, for psyllid control, it's absolutely genius on potatoes. And we've certainly shown on the potatoes as well, the actual direct impact of the mesh in terms of modifying the light spectrum, the microclimate. We think there's a really significant increase in yield just using the mesh alone, 10-20% kind of figures. So yeah, to me it's a genius thing out there.
You're trying to make this huge leap in 2 years. Do you have data and studies from like North America and Europe that are helping you?
Yeah, so what myself and Morgan did is the industry gave us a list of their main pests. Morgan and myself went to the literature and said, basically dug up the ecology and the biology of the pests, and also any natural enemies that have been already identified as attacking those pests. And then we went back to the literature and said, right, what SNAP resources have been shown to help those beneficials? So we do have a lot of stuff underpinning it, but in terms of putting it together as a big whole, There's not a lot of people who have done that. And it's if you're going to do really good, you know, full system science on that, yeah, kiss goodbye to a decade and millions of dollars. So I will go into that later on, and so will Asher as well. Okay, so this is the bigger introduction to the project itself. So the previous one was a primer on what agroecology, IPM and biocontrol is. This is the project itself. So I want to give a bit of perspective around this stuff to start with as well. Then look at what's called the ESR concept. So this will help you get a better handle on what the system redesign is. Then we're going to very brief list of what the pests are. Ash is going to give you the detail on the pests, what the beneficials are, what the enhancement and what this transformation looks like. So kind of not needing to dwell on this is now kind of pretty obvious kind of stuff. There's a lot of global challenges humanity faces. How do you get a handle on this stuff? Some of this stuff's almost too big to get your head around. And so I use these two frameworks, the 9 planetary boundaries and ecosystem services. So this is how I get a handle on this stuff. So 9 planetary boundaries. About 15 years ago, some very smart people said, right, okay, what are the key operating parameters of the planet? A bit like what's the RPM in an engine? And so they identified these 9 ones here. Climate change, no explanation. Required novel entities. This is stuff like pesticides and plastics, so all the synthetic chemistry humanity's created. Biogeochemical flows, too much P and N in the environment. Biosphere integrity used to simply be called biodiversity loss of species. And so having identified this, and land system change here, this is basically turning natural ecosystems, bush into farmland and farmland into cities. So they also said, right, okay, these are the key operating parameters. How are we going? So traffic light system, climate change is actually still in the yellow zone. Biosphere integrity, biodiversity loss, and too much P and N in the environment are in the red zone. They're bigger problems than climate change. The novel entities and a couple of others there, they've got question marks. We simply don't have enough data to make a call on this. The UN is so worried about novel entities, they are now setting up an international panel like the one on climate change and biodiversity to drive the science on this to find out where, turn that question mark into a traffic light signal. So this for me in terms of farming is part of the planet, growing is part of the planet. So when we're looking at farming and growing systems, we need to say, how are these things impacting planetary boundaries? And if you haven't heard of planetary boundaries before, there's a chap called David Attenborough, may have heard of him. He's done a film about it with Johan Rockström, who came up with this idea originally. This stuff is now public level kind of stuff, so if you can't get Netflix, you can just flick this stuff up on Google, go and find the 9 Planetary Boundaries website and read up some more information about it there. The other framework I use is ecosystem services, and this is essentially measured, this was developed at least 50 years ago now, this is very, very old hand stuff, but essentially has worked out what are all the outputs of an ecosystem. Your orchards, your vineyards, your farms are all ecosystems. So they produce all of these outputs. Food is up the top there. It's one of about 25, depending on how people have divvied this stuff up, output. Air quality regulation there at 3 o'clock. Who got paid for the oxygen their orchard produced last year? Year before? Any years? Anybody get paid for any ecosystem services you produced on your place at all, ever, apart from food? Bit of a problem here. The fresh water thing, the dairy guys have been getting it in the neck because they over-focused on the food and dropped the ball on the nitrogen going into the water ecosystem service, and now everybody's kicking up stink. They weren't paying for it when it was being provided for free, but now they've dropped the ball on it, everybody's complaining like hell. And you're kind of going, I kind of look at this and kind of go, there's a problem here. Basically, farmers and growers are only getting paid for one ecosystem service and they're producing a whole load that everybody else is getting for free. Why aren't they getting paid for this stuff? I actually know people that are kind of thinking about how to use stuff like crowdfunding platforms to pay farmers and growers for the real ecosystem services they provide, the whole shooting match. So this isn't kind of abstract academic stuff either. So I look at farming and growing and kind of going, right, what's the whole ecosystem output of this, including food? So how do we start addressing all of this? And for me, the answer is really simple. It's biodiversity. This is a bit of an alien concept in farming and growing. So I'm going to give you 2 examples that show just the utter importance of biodiversity in farming systems. The first is this. This is the Jena experiment in Germany. It's actually an ecological experiment trying to prove or disprove a whole load of really esoteric ecological or theoretical arguments. But the good news for farming and growing, they're using traditional hay meadows as their model ecosystem. Now I'm using this example because this is just enormous. 20 years they've been running this, and it's the son of a project, of a previous project. There's 600 plots here, there's 100 scientists working on this, plus the choir of students and technicians and stuff. This is just enormous. The amount of data and science this is generating is absolutely enormous, and this is the best quality science at a global level you can possibly do. So the data coming out of this is astonishingly rigorous. And so they've written a summary paper, which if you're having problems sleeping, you can download for free from the internet, and it's a mere 70 pages long. The abstract is 2 pages long. Unfortunately, I can summarise their summary paper in 1 page, because the results from the kind of old agricultural perspective of monoculture's best is just jaw-dropping. And so they were using up to 60 species in a pasture. And literally, if they increased it from 20 species to 25 or 50 species to 55, they could detect the change every time they increased diversity. And this is what it increased. It increased yield. You almost can stop worrying about the rest. But basically everything they measured, increasing diversity, improved. So stuff like nutrient cycle, soil organic matter, soil carbon, drought resilience, flood resilience, the whole stability, more efficient use of water, improved soil health, reduced pest diseases and weeds as you increase diversity. So if you don't want to read the paper, they've actually got a nice little 10-minute video in English on their website you can go and look at. The second example I use is this paper here. And so this is called a second-order meta-study. A meta-study is where a statistician, nerdy kind of person, gets a whole load of primary research papers, like somebody's done an experiment, on a particular topic, in this case agricultural diversification. They throw out all the rubbish papers, which I always find a massive concern that they got published in the first place. They pull all the good quality papers together, get all their data, and then reanalyse it as one kind of massive single data set. So what a meta-study does is it gives you massive confidence in the data because there's so much original experimentation being called on. So a meta-meta study is where an even more nerdy statistician gets a whole load of first-order meta-studies on a particular topic and reanalyzes those. Just jaw-dropping. This is the first one that's ever been done in agriculture. Apparently it's really common in medicine because there is, of course, a vastly greater amount of science being done in medicine. But to give you an idea, over 5,000 original studies, over nearly 42,000 original comparisons between simplified and diversified practices. There is a colossal amount of data underpinning this. Almost basically, this is the entire sum of knowledge. So when a scientist kind of goes, oh, diversification, I wonder if this idea will work, 67% of the time it had a positive benefit. That's pretty good odds down at the lotto shop. 23% of the time it had no effect, and 10% of the time only randomly picking some kind of diversification had a negative effect on everything. So breaking those headline figures down, we've got soil fertility, crop yield. The 2 ones I want to pick out here, crop yield, randomly kind of pick a diversification, 50% of the time your yield goes up. That's completely contrary to kind of all this thinking in ag and hort science for the last 70 odd years. 16% of the time you get a negative effect, and 34% of the time no effect. Our department here, pest control, 63% of the time positive, 10% negative, 20% neutral. And as farmers and growers, you simply go, great, we'll ignore that 10 and 27%, whatever they did, whatever those guys that got the 63% positive result, we will go and do that. So, this is the kind of world I live in, and so this is my answer. If you want to fix a whole load of problems in ag and hort, You know, 9 planetary boundaries, ecosystem services thinking. The answer is plant diversity. That's kind of it. We can go home now. Oh no. So this ESR concept. So this was developed ages ago by Hill and McRae, 1996. And so they said, right, okay, so the conventional full Monte calendar spraying, the E in an ESR is efficiency. So that's moving to an IPM system using AgChem. The next step on is substitution. So you're still using IPM, but you substitute your chemicals for some biologicals. And then you take the next step further and you go for this redesign, system redesign. And this is where agroecology fits. It's not about kind of just putting some biological sprays on. It's kind of go, right, how does this whole ecosystem work? Let's redesign it so we achieve the outcomes we want. And that's typically using stuff like ecosystem services such as pest control. So Jeff's shown you a quick flick through here. Absolutely standard perennial crop system. It's citrus, but basically any perennial crop, pretty much anywhere in the developed world, looks like this. Crop, herbicide strip underneath it, and some grass to drive the tractor. It's a really simplified ecosystem. And the reason a lot of the time with these simplified ecosystems you have pest and disease problems and weeds is because it's so simple. There's a huge amount of free lunch here for all the pests that like your crop. And so their numbers can go up because they've almost got an unlimited food supply. You grow them tons and tons of food and they're very happily going to eat it. For the weeds, herbicide strip, weeds like bare ground. They don't like competition. So the bare ground we're creating with herbicides is the ideal location for weeds to colonise. So we're also using pesticides in these systems. So these are wiping out the beneficials, the natural enemies. The beneficials that are there, they're hungry, they've got nowhere to live, so there's no snack for them there. And these unfilled ecological niches for the weeds to jump in. There's not much biodiversity here. That's also causing a decline in soil health. So there's loads of issues from an ecological perspective with this setup. So the agroecological solution here is to try and fix everything at once. The project was set up with a focus on arthropods, but that was kind of a bit of a misunderstanding in the fact that you don't just fix arthropods with the agroecological manipulations. You try and fix the whole problem, all the problems all at once. So what we're aiming to do is increase plant biodiversity to achieve all these outcomes. Not only controlling the pests, fix the soil health, manage the weeds, improve biodiversity, so basically address all planetary boundaries and increase ecosystem services. So citrus is this model crop, but this applies equally to all crops. The industry gave us this list of pests, and it's a really great list of pests because it's really diverse. We've got Wi-Fi, aphids, mites, moth, thrips, and a beetle, the borer. So these are really, really diverse. So this is a kind of really interesting challenge from a scientific point of view. So Morgan, as myself, as I said a bit earlier, in answer to your question out there, we dive into the literature. We see what the literature says for each of these pests in terms of their biology and ecology, what natural enemies that already exist in New Zealand, so not something overseas that we can't use. So stuff here in New Zealand, either just in the environment we can buy at the Biocontrol shop, and we also looked to see if there's any other issues that needed sorting out. And so we came up with this list of natural enemies and the other things. Ant controls, this is just alphabetical. Ant control is an important aspect of this, as well as mating disruption, pheromone mating disruption. But when we kind of came up with this list for all those pests, one of the things Morgan and myself looked at each other and said, a bunch of usual suspects here. You know, if you're in this space and you kind of go, we need some beneficial insects in here, some biocontrol agents, you'd be kind of going, probably carabid beetles, hoverflies, lacewings, ladybirds, parasitoids, are you all going to be your main bet? So it's kind of interesting with a really diverse range of pests. We kind of came up with a fairly almost conservative or usual suspect list here. So then back into the literature, as I said before, what snap do these things need? So this is what the result we've come up with, and I'll go into the details of some of this, what we are doing in a future presentation here. So we're going to put a whole bunch of legumes under the trees. Bird's foot trefoil, this thing's in the way here, isn't it? Let me just see if I can flick this up somewhere out of the way. bird's foot trefoil, and I'm now not in that frame, and alyssum, because it's just morphologically similar. So those guys go under the trees. Then the grass strip in the middle gets an upgrade. So we put in a really diverse pasture mix. Here a whole bunch of grass species, some more legumes and forbs, and generally in any kind of mixture you want those 3 plant types: grasses, legumes, forbs. That's what's really critical, having something from each of those 3 groups. So put all of these things in here, and they go down that pasture strip, and we also stop mowing the bejesus out of it, because we want these things to go to flower, so this stuff needs to be allowed to grow. So you can go and park the tractor up and stop mowing everything as well, and stop spraying everything. So this is just this is basically the tractor and the shed stuff. So hopefully we're just saving money right at the start here by not driving the tractor around the place. I'm sorry if you like driving the tractor around the place. Go find somewhere else to drive the tractor, okay? And then, because this is research, normally I'd have kind of gone, this is great, we'll just walk away, because these are all perennials. They can hopefully sit there for years, needing very little maintenance, but we're kind of going the full Monty here. So we're going to add in some annual plants here, and partly the reason we did put the annuals in is because 2 of Steve's Holy Trinity, the buckwheat and phacelia, are annuals. So we really, really wanted to have those in the system. So what we're going to do is basically go and blow a strip out just along the edge, probably between the pasture and the clovers under the trees, and then zone till, strip till in some annuals, and we'll do that sequentially, because of course the annuals are going to grow, flower and die. So we need to regularly sow those to get a sequential flowering across the orchard. And here's these before and after shots, as Jeff has also shown you before. So it really is quite a transformation. So something else is going on here. I've been in this space for a very long time. So I had a pretty clear idea what the destination looked like before Morgan and myself actually started diving into the literature. What that gave us is the rigour of the scientific rigour and the particular plant species. And having started my career as a grower, I know some things are not very practical that scientists come up with. They come up with some really daft ideas at times, don't they? God. So kind of sunflowers. Sunflowers were really good for beneficials. Yeah, who wants sunflowers in the middle of their tractor row? Hello? So I've already put a filter through this and said, what's actually going to fly in terms of real-world orchard production? Is it going to completely, out-complete the trees and knacker your yield? It's out, gone, it's already been dealt with. So this stuff has been heavily filtered on the theory and experience to say, right, okay, this is actually going to work at a practical level in terms of everything else that happens in an orchard as well. And there ends this presentation. Questions?
How those things you put in the strip where you drive your tractor down, you
Yep.
instead of drive it for harvesting,
Yep.
outside spraying, are those things resistant to sort of treading?
Yeah, so what part of the thing is, and as we're out looking at some of these orchards that Matt's going to be talking about later, at some point you might go, there's too much vegetation here, the guys can't go in and harvest, just put a mower through it. Everything under the trees and everything in the pasture strip, they're all designed for grazing and mowing. So part of it is, as we go through this, work out what's practical, what's required. So this is an experiment in terms of a learning experience, in terms of, is this actually going to work? So we're going to put this on a 1/4 hectare block, so 50 by 50 metres, and it's an experiment in terms of we're making a bit of a guess here in terms of it's a big leap forward, and we will invariably, as we're going through this, going, that's just ain't working, is it? No, it's just hopeless, and we'll change tack. So it's very much kind of learning by doing.
In 2019, when I planted young citrus, I planted chicory and red clover between the row. And my idea was in doing that was that chicory with a very long taproot help recycle nutrients and improve drainage as an annual when it dies off. And it worked fantastic, and I decided, but where I went wrong, I decided I didn't mow it. It got real high, it looked absolutely beautiful with all these blue flowers. And it provided great shelter for the trees. And then I wanted it to reseed, and it did that.
Too
The
well.
side effect of that was I had a master there, like we have in the beech forest,
Oh, yep.
and a huge invasion of mice and rats, and they chewed holes in my irrigation tank. And now,
Man, that's law of unintended consequences, isn't it?
now like I've just trimmed it and top it. But the interesting thing is that's 2 years old now, and as an annual, because the crown's not being disturbed by animals' feet,
Yep.
it's actually still very vigorous,
Right.
even though it's classified as an annual. And the red clover is still there, so I've still got a real biodiversity. And what I did notice about that was I didn't get the white fly in my citrus and those young trees. But I've also got a massive invasion now of snails that are all living off the chicory,
Yep.
but they're hiding from the birds in my spray darts.
Oh, right, yeah. That's a nightmare. Yeah, look, this is classic ecology, unintended consequences, and it's really interesting we're talking about shelter, because we just visited one of the sites yesterday, and using broad beans and oats and vetch and stuff as that nursery crop. Trees down here, beans up here, and shelter as well. That was one of the things that came up. So part of this is this learning by doing, and so you run into something like the mice or the rats or the slugs, and it's kind of like, right, okay, how are we going to manage this? What do we do? So it's really, just literally figuring stuff out as we're going along. But it's interesting. Was it the whitefly you said?
Yeah.
So the fact that those populations are down, the clovers are, we've got a lot of clovers in here, and the nectar and pollen in clovers are really good for a whole bunch of beneficials. And so it's quite likely, and they're providing good habitat as well.
The other thing that was down was hares.
Hares. Oh, right. That's interesting, because one of the other orchards we went to yesterday that's basically kind of sprayed ground mostly. Massive problem with hares he's having.
But because I think it's because they feel vulnerable to predators, because the chicory gets tall,
Yep.
they can't see things coming, so they stay out of it.
Yep. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, to me, this is what we're hoping is we're going to get a lot of lessons out of this. And part of the idea of this social media is people that are trying stuff, they get on there and they're kind of going, yeah, this is working really great apart from this slug problem. What do we do about the slugs? And hopefully then lots of people can chime in, with suggestions and answers.
Is going down this path, getting away from chemicals, hopefully, are we going to be a step ahead of when legislation changes?
Yeah, look, I mean, well, the whole Lighter Touch project, and Jeff can iterate on this more, is about pesticide reduction. So that's the main aim, but also kind of, because I'm driving quite a bit of this, I'm kind of going, just pesticide reduction. I'm kind of going, planetary boundaries, all this stuff needs fixing. So let's try and attack everything at once. But pesticide reduction, and what we're hoping is we've got enough biodiversity in here and a couple of other things such as mating disruption and ant control. What we're hoping is you guys can park the sprayer up and just leave it in the shed. That's the game plan here. Part of the thing, the Apples and Pears Conference, one of the plant and food guys said it calculated how many kilometres were driven by tractors in all the Hawke's Bay apple crops spraying, and it was something like 80,000 kilometres, which is, several towns around the world. You're going to go on a tractor and with a sprayer on the back, 4K, going around the world 4 times? Far out. There's a lot of money spent just driving tractors around, let alone the cost of the ag chem going into the sprayer. So it's kind of, okay, if we can dramatically reduce the amount of spraying you need to do, then you've got cost savings in here as well. Because clearly some of this stuff's just not going to fly. If we're going to say, this is going to double your cost and halve your profit, you're kind of be going, right, where's the exit, sorry? So part of this is kind of going, how do we redesign the system, like us in the agroecology principles, to make this more profitable, and more resilient, and more sustainable, and more fun.
You also see in the future that there's going to be legal restrictions on the amount of sprays and chemicals.
Yeah, I mean it's not my department, but certainly if you talk to anybody in the industry globally, that's the direction of travel. Look at the EU, tons of chemicals we've got here they banned, some of them ages ago. So you can almost certainly, and the rate of new chemical discovery, not new brands, but actually fundamentally new modes of action, very, very little new stuff. Certainly in herbicides that I know about, no new modes of action developed since the 1980s. ALSs were the last mode of action developed. The 1980s is a long time ago now, and the ag chem companies have spent billions of dollars looking for new stuff, because that's their business model. they haven't found anything that they can turn into a legal effective product. I found lots of stuff that will kill plants, that's not a problem. Finding something that will meet regulations, societal demands, and be an effective, cost-effective economic product, nothing. So you just kind of assume you're going to have less pesticides. That chemical toolbox will just keep shrinking and shrinking, and the biological and the ecological ones keep growing. That's the good news, and the physics as well. And if you want to, the mesh is a good example of a physical technique. And certainly I'll be recommending, it'll be worthwhile trying on your crops, putting some mesh over your crops. And I go, but they're trees. Yeah, Europe, there's thousands of hectares of apples in the centre of Europe under mesh because they can't control codling moth with chemistry. So yeah, whole orchards under insect netting.